Today, I'm very happy to have with me Eliza Mondegreen. Eliza is a grad student writing articles about women's rights and gender ideology from her page at elizamondegreen.substack.com. I became aware of Eliza and her work through Twitter and asked her to join me for a continuation of this discussion on the intersection between women's rights and trans activism that has dominated the headlines recently. It is my intention through this discussion to unravel the various opinions that can differ wildly from person to person. And I've asked Eliza to join me and provide her insights into what is arguably one of the defining debates of this moment in time. Eliza, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I realize your name is it's just John, right? I can just...
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm Adam as far as Twitter goes, but
okay.
I'm John over here. It doesn't matter. It's okay.
What should I call you? Because I would like to say like...
You can call me Adam.
Okay. That's my brother's name, actually. So
right on.
Thank you for having me, Adam.
You're very welcome. And I'm really happy to have this conversation. We'd be kind of like going around trying to make it work. For myself, I've been kind of in a bit of a transition here. And I'm excited to have this conversation with you because, like I said, I have kind of a new setup now. And I took a little bit of a personal hiatus to start a new job and move into a new place and, just generally kind of hit the reboot button in my life. So having this opportunity to talk to you about this is, for me, it's just something that it's helpful to me to kind of be able to gather my thoughts. And through this conversation, that's what I'm hoping that we can provide the audience. So to start things off and give the audience some context, I wanted to express briefly my own personal experience with gender ideology to give us a springboard into our conversation. Like many people, I was born into a religious conservative family, which later in life I moved away from as the demands of the corporate world and the education system pushed me towards a more agnostic and atheistic frame of mind. With the rise of gender ideology, I found myself examining the more extreme liberal views that I've adopted in service of a more balanced perspective, as it's appeared to me, especially with the rise of Trump in the US, that there are extremes in every ideological position, with the political system and media amplifying extremism on both ends of the spectrum. This creating non-negotiable ultimatums, whether it be MAGA, QAnon, ultra-conservatism, or neoliberal progressive wokeism. Both extremes demand full compliance to their worldview, with threats of violence against any perceived opposition and either threats of eternal damnation, depending on who you're talking to, or public humiliation and doxing for being a bigot. On one side, you have intolerant forms of, we'll call it heteronormative monogamy, denying any room for a gender non-conforming lifestyle or alternative sexual orientations. And on the other, males are self-identifying as female and qualifying themselves as a class of women that deserves no distinction, which some people don't seem to find problematic. My personal opinion of this position changed a few years ago when J.K. Rowling started to be singled out as a TERF for her views. And the trans women are women mantra became an excuse to call anyone a bigot who disagreed with gender ideology. As someone who grew up in a conservative environment, this seemed to me to be just a bit too much like the accusations of witchcraft against Rowling made by many evangelicals. I believe that this demonstrates the need for balance in our society, as both extremes provide an open door for the worst examples of human nature to be let loose. As an example of this, we're now seeing the dismantling of Roe versus Wade, while simultaneously the word woman has suddenly become a lightning rod for debate. While there are a variety of issues that I find with both extremes, in regards to gender ideology, my main concern is the erosion of women's safety in order to accommodate males who self-identify as female and use this leverage as a way of infiltrating women's sports, safe spaces, and even prisons. Connected to this is a concern about non-negotiable ultimatums that create more conflict and division in the political landscape and almost ensure retaliation from right-wing extremists. Ultimately, I believe that gender ideology does more harm than good for the gender nonconforming community and has demonstrated itself, in my opinion, to be homophobic and misogynistic in numerous examples, putting women at risk and intentionally targeting any perceived opposition for the purpose of public humiliation and threatening the livelihood of those it brands heretics. In a previous discussion about women's rights and safety, I spoke with Amy E. Souza, aka Known Heretic, about her experiences with trans advocates, first during a women's march for the Me Too movement, where trans advocates were calling demonstrators at the event transphobic for wearing hats that resembled female genitalia. With all that in mind, by way of introduction, Eliza Mondegreen has joined me today, and we're going to discuss her experiences with gender ideology and the work she continues to do through her website and on social media to contribute to this conversation. So Eliza, to start off, you have a great thread pinned to your Twitter that I think is a great explanation of your own misgivings about gender ideology. But just to give the audience a sense of where you come into this conversation, what experiences led you to taking a stance on these issues?
That's a good question. I would say that the first time this issue crossed my radar was probably 2014, maybe it was 2013. I was involved in women's reproductive rights advocacy. And the thing that I noticed when trans activism entered that space was a sense of constriction followed it. So we were in a women's organization talking about women's issues, and all of a sudden there were all of these new, or maybe not so new, depending on your perspective, taboos popping up around naming who was affected by abortion restrictions, talking about women's bodies. And the language that we were being asked to use made everything that we had to do harder. And every minute that we spent talking about, how to avoid the clear language that we had always used and the language that we had prided ourselves on using was time that we were not spending defending abortion access. We were 10 minutes from the state capitol building. And while legislators were at the state capitol building passing, abortion bans, abortion restrictions, they were passing waiting periods, they were passing requirements for, not medically necessary ultrasounds, they were imposing waiting periods, and we were talking about uterus havers. And that seemed like time that was not well spent to me. But at that time, it was still possible to avoid the issue. A few years later, that would not be the case, especially if you work and live and have friends on the left. And I guess a lot of things happened between 2014 and now that made this issue much more salient for me. And one of them is that I had several friends who transitioned, and those aren't my stories and I'm not really going to talk about them here, but I would say that those experiences had a big effect on me. I think that being up close, it made it impossible for some of the things that I had passively accepted without examining it made it hard to hold on to some of the things that I had passively accepted. If that makes sense.
Sure.
It didn't add up anymore after seeing it up close.
Right. Yeah, I know for me, and I get the sense that you had somewhat of a similar experience where I genuinely wanted to know more.
Yes.
I genuinely wanted to see myself as an ally.
Yeah.
I genuinely wanted to, if I had any lingering discrimination, it was like, okay, I want to be open-minded here, right? And I've seen other people have this same experience, and that is that the more that they look into it, the more that they start having misgivings about it. And one thing that you said that I really liked was you talked about black holes in your article. And I thought that was such a great visual for, just looking at this, the idea of seeing these distortions around these issues and kind of being like, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? But then when you go to ask questions about it, and the more that you look into it, the more that I feel that there's like a sense of gatekeeping and a feeling of like, if you're going to come in here and start asking questions, then you're going to ask questions the way that we want you to.
Yeah.
And I think that I'll say for myself that coming from a conservative background, that was frustrating for me, because I think what I was trying to do is come to a middle ground. I'm like, let's find a middle ground here. What's the middle ground, right? And then what I found was, it's like going into a negotiation and finding out that the other person's holding all the cards and that they're not going to give you any wiggle room. And even questions become suspicious, because like, where is it coming from, right? And if there's a whiff of any adherence to more conservative type mindset, then it's like, oh, okay, we've got one here, you know. And I feel like this to me is just the opposite of what evangelicals are doing when they're demanding that people go to church, and they're demanding that people worship a certain way, and they're demanding that people live their lives a certain way and love a certain way and all this kind of stuff, right? Where it's like, okay, now I just feel like I've escaped one thing and run straight into another.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah. So it was there. So you said you had friends that were kind of, and not to like go too deep into it, but I think that I've also had a similar kind of experience where I've had some friends who, I've lost friends because this is something that I want to understand and I want to dissect. And I've lost friends because I say, well, you know, I can agree with trans rights or human rights, but as soon as you start saying trans women are women, then that's the part where I go, okay, wait a second, what am I signing up for here?
Yeah.
And that's where to me, when you get to that point, then it's like, now to me it starts resembling religious dogma, and the same kind of competition that you see within religion from one form of dogma doctrine to another, right? And I think that's why I want to look at it, and that's why I want to pull it out into the light and be like, look at this, okay? Like, we have to understand here that we're all human beings, and as much as you want to like see yourself as being, you know, this enlightened person who has all the answers, we're all fallible, we all make mistakes, and in order for us to try to come to a middle ground, there has to be consensus, right? And when you look at just conflicts between nations, when there's no consensus, the result is war. So I feel like that's at the heart of what's going on right now with the, on one end, you have abortion being, what's the word here? Is it criminalized? Do we say it, has it been criminalized again, or basically it's just been taken out of law?
I mean, it's
what's the right word
state by
here?
state. I think it's
okay.
The right to have an abortion before a certain time period has been lost for women.
Okay. And simultaneously, simultaneously, this is one of the real issues that I see right now on, let's say, the Democrat liberal side, is that they've lost any bargaining chip in this discussion now, where the left used to be kind of where women's rights gravitated towards. And now we're in this just very strange position where women's rights is really at the center of these extremes?
Yeah, it seems like women's rights are at the center of a tug of war, and that's not a great place to be when you just want to live your life.
Mhm. For sure.
And I think that that is probably a feeling that, you know, people who identify as trans can really relate to right now. I don't think that the situations are analogous, but you know, it doesn't feel good to have what you understand to be your basic, you know, your identity, your place in society, to feel like that's up for debate. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important that we that those of us who are on the left who have concerns about gender identity ideology, that we make it really clear what the conflict is, and that the conflict isn't some people, I want to make sure that I say this right.
It's like walking in a landmine field, right?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
like walking amongst landmines.
Yeah.
The way that I see it, the conflict between gender identity and sex is not necessary. It's not inherent. It is a product of a strategic decision made by trans activist lobby groups across the West to advance their idea of trans rights by equating sex and gender identity. Without that equation of sex and gender identity, there is not a conflict. The reason I believe that these organizations have decided that they have to equate sex and gender identity is because there are some things that trans activists want that you cannot get unless you collapse sex and gender identity into the same thing. So there is no way that if we say sex and gender identity are different and we mean it, that we're going to have men in women's prisons. There's no way we're going to have men in women's sports. There's no way we're going to have men taking women's political representation, like has happened in some districts that have a male and a female representative for, you know, for organizing purposes in the US. Those things won't be possible if these organizations take an approach that doesn't equate sex and gender identity. But what will be possible is the things that I think everybody should want for people who identify as trans, which is that people have basic respect and dignity. They have protection from being discriminated against in housing and employment, and that they have a, you know, that they have a place in society, but that place is not women's place.
Right. Yeah, this is where, like I kind of mentioned earlier, that I just feel in a lot of ways, it does more harm than good to gender non-conforming people. Now, some people may disagree with that and feel like, no, they're advancing gender non-conformity. But I think part of my position on this kind of comes from a just a basic theory of health and wellness. And what are the underlying issues a lot of times in people's lives that may contribute to the decisions that they make. You know, when you're looking at dysphoria and where it comes from and, you know, what the result, there's a lot of different elements to it, I think, that can be explored that are not being explored. They're not being discussed honestly, because I think to some degree, for better or for worse, we are trying to be kind on some level. I think there is an actual desire to be kind to people who are I don't know, maybe call them misfits of society, or you know, just people who, whatever, they don't necessarily fit an ideal mold. And in some ways, that's kind of what I feel like where this is stemming from, is people who don't fit a mold, and so because of that, they feel like it's an indication of gender fluidity or something of the sort. But I'll kind of contribute this, my own personal perspective. Growing up, at some point, I became a victim, you might say, of the California fast food diet, and gained weight. And through that, it was like something that at this point in my life to look back on and reflect is kind of like, okay, we need to examine all of the different things that are contributing to how we're developing as human beings on a personal level, but also on a larger level. And I think that just when you look at sort of obesity levels over the past however long, and how our concept of ourselves as human beings has kind of shifted and morphed, not just because of that, but also because of other various things that are contributing to, I think, this mentality. And part of that is, it seems obvious to me that this is very heavily influenced by technology, in this case, medical technology, the advancement of medical technology, and our ability to medicate our problems, medicalize our problems in various ways, where I think where I kind of come at this from is the idea of, like, in many cases, medication is good. Medication can save your life. It can do some important, some necessary things. But for example, if somebody goes to the doctor and says, doctor, I'm overweight, and do you have any medication that you can give me to help me with this situation? Is that the best solution? No, I don't think it is. I think the best solution is for somebody to adopt good eating habits and good, just general exercise habits and whatnot. But we've kind of, in our pharmaceutical society, where we have, medication commercials, every other commercial, and, for stuff that we don't even know what they're selling sometimes. I think this is, on some level, it's a sickness that we've developed as a society, is a reliance on medical technology to deal with issues that actually have underlying causes that we're not looking at because we're trying to be too nice.
So I think one of the major areas that I've focused on in my own attempts to study this issue has been medicalization, and that really what you're talking about, and that medicalization really has two sides. And one of them is jumping to medical solutions like pharmaceuticals. But the first half of that is to frame a problem as a medical problem. And I think that right now we're framing a lot of very human problems as medical problems. And that gender dysphoria is a perfect example of this, because it is such an enormous and nebulous concept that people who feel uncomfortable, people who feel like they don't fit in, people who are autistic, people who are having trouble accepting their sexual orientation, girls who are going through puberty, like, they're all encouraged to see themselves in this medical framework. And they get to hear the thing that everybody who's suffering wants to hear, which is, here's the solution.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is not unsimilar to somebody, recommending Jesus, right? You're having a hard time in your life. Everything's going down the shitter. Give your life to Jesus, right? And the thing is that to some degree, this actually does work for a lot of people. And I think that a parallel can even be made with people who transition, where, does it help people? Does it improve certain people's quality of life? Arguably it does. But the question to me is kind of this larger question, is how are we as a society in general dealing with our problems? And that, I think, is like looking at my own life. If I take a look at my life and I go, you got problems, man, you got issues, you got to deal with your issues, I can either have an honest conversation with myself about that and do what I can to try to get good solutions, or I can go to a snake oil salesman and, maybe get the placebo, might make me feel better for a moment or something like that. Who knows? But
Mhm.
I feel like there's an important underlying conversation that's not necessarily being had here. And I think it is sort of evident in the extremes. When you look at the extremes and their solutions to the problems and then try to compare them,
Mhm.
then that to me is kind of where it's like, okay, we're all kind of trying to get to the same place, but we're all kind of trying to get there differently and then get mad at everybody for not doing it the way that we think that it should be done, right?
Yeah, I think that's part of it.
So just to kind of pull at the strands of what we were just talking about the internet and its contribution to this discussion. The rise of technology. I think we were kind of getting into that, just the rise of technology and how it's transformed our mentality, our as human beings, we relate differently to these kind of challenges, right? If you don't like the color of your hair, you can go get it dyed. If you don't like your teeth, you can go get
Mhm.
braces. If you don't like, you know what I mean? Like we're very much in this place now where it's like, what's so fascinating is just a bit like Amazon, you know, you just with the snap of a finger, the click of a button, you can order whatever you want. It shows up right at your door. Um, and the internet, the to me, I really I'm a gamer. I like playing video games. I totally see how video games are contributing to this mentality. Um, when you go into a video game and you create your character, you
Mhm.
know, you could be male, you could be female. Now they're giving you more options, so you can, you know, be this, that, or the other if you want. I really feel like that has contributed to. I'm gonna unblur my thing here because it keeps blurring. It's annoying me. Hopefully nothing's too bad in the background. I think it's all right. But you know, just that what we were talking about right there, like I think it's become this, it's almost like the internet has become a technology by which we can expand our personalities and identities.
Mhm.
And I'll be the first to admit I do that. My name's not Adam. You know what I mean?
My
Like
name's not Eliza.
yeah, well, there you go, right? So I'll tell you my real name off the air. But you know what I mean? It's like, but this is what the internet affords us, right? This is,
Mhm.
you know, Twitter allows me to step into this personality. Facebook also affords the same thing. Video games, any game, you know, is that it's you're stepping into the shoes of this character, and in some of the more involved RPGs, I mean, there's a lot there that I think the personality can sink into. And so I kind of feel a bit of a whistleblower by talking about this. Like, I feel like just if there's any gamers listening to this, they'll probably get upset with me. But I think that it's, to me, my feeling on this is that I kind of go back to where things started for me to unravel in this. And that really comes down to the trans women are women mantra, where when it was trans rights or human rights, then I could very much see the benefit of gender nonconformity. I could see the benefit of males being more female and females being more male, more balance in our
Mhm.
uh, in how we relate to that conceptual aspect of ourselves. I believe this kind of gets into Jungian psychology with the idea of the anima and the animus and all of that. The idea of like, you know, we all have a relationship to these archetypes. In this case, you know, like as a male, my relationship to the female archetype is such that I feel as a male that it is advantageous for me to understand that, for me to open myself up to it, to allow that to redefine my more patriarchal notions that I grew up with. However, for me to get to the point to where I start to say, but I am a woman, you know, okay, I have long hair. Is that the qualifier at this point? Like, do I just, if I grow my hair long and I just start calling myself,
I don't think you even need to do that at this point.
Yeah, don't even have to do that at this point, right? Like, I can go get a haircut now.
You've already been an overachiever.
So I think that what I've been trying to do is I've been trying to explore this idea of gender nonconformity and champion the idea that, yeah, you can be a gender nonconformist, but that doesn't mean you have to deny reality and that you have to force your perspective on other people, because now what we're doing is we're just turning into religious club wielding monkeys, you know what I mean, who are beating everybody on the head who don't agree with us, you know. I've compared everything that's going on in the trans with trans advocacy to like some kind of an inquisition. I mean, thank God we're in a place at this time where, you know, people aren't getting burnt at the stake or anything like that. But I feel as though the human reaction is the same thing.
Yeah, I think, I mean, as somebody who studied, you know, the growth of authoritarian movements in the 20th century, living through the last couple of years, not at all intending to equate these experiences, but it has given me a lot of insight into basically these dynamics of human groups in particular and how they keep resurfacing over time. And I think when we don't, I don't know, something that I've been trying to write about trans activism, and I've been running into a little bit of a writer's block, is to say, like, what happens when you have a movement that defines itself as progressive and defines itself as all good feelings, but is in fact a movement made out of human beings, and so it attracts all kinds of people, and it attracts, you know, it attracts opportunists, it attracts, you know, people who are trying to kind of take advantage of the situation, it attracts a couple of predators, and
there's this strange just denial of it, of like, no, it's not going to happen to us, you know what I mean? And that to me is where I really have an issue, and I feel like there's just some serious cognitive dissonance going on there, you know what I mean? Like just to say this really quick, like I've pointed this out before, where I'm like, all right, a lot of the same people who scream about the patriarchy and toxic masculinity don't seem to draw a connection between that and allowing males to self-identify as female. What do you think happens? You know what I mean? Like, it's like, it's very magical thinking. It's very, to me, it's very religious thinking. It's very like, close your eyes, la, 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 and just hope that things go your way. And the problem is that it often escalates into aggression.
Yes, it often escalates into aggression. I think just on a more basic level, like, there is a denial of humanity, of human nature, happening on multiple levels. And where we see that at work with trans is we have a movement that denies that it is fallible, like every human movement. We have people who are denying that they are sexed, like every human being. Of course, these things are at some point going to run up against a hard fact.
And I think that hard fact for me is the inevitable, coming from a conservative perspective, I feel like the inevitable backlash. Like, what did you expect? You just thought that every conservative evangelical, you know, traditionalist was just going to be okay with that, be okay with you calling everybody a bigot who doesn't, you know what I mean? It's like, coming from a conservative perspective, it's like, what are you trying to achieve? Like, are you hoping that everybody who disagrees with you just dies, just disappears, just doesn't go vote?
I think that is I think that that's a symptom of a broader breakdown, but it's definitely like there's this idea that we don't all have to go on living together somehow.
Yeah. Right.
And that's just not reality based. So
Yeah.
I also worry that we're courting a massive backlash.
I do feel as though what's happened with Roe v. Wade is an example of that. I think the Don't Say Gay bill, or whatever you want to call it, I think is an example of that. I think that because I feel like, again, it's backlash. It is the pendulum swinging the other direction. You know, it's like, okay, you know, we're all singing Kumbaya and running through the fields, but, you know, okay, don't forget that there's still other people out there.
Yeah, I can't remember who said it, but it was like the worst enemy of an ordinary person who identifies as trans is trans activism. That it takes, you know, I think the way that Dave Chappelle put it, or the way that Dave Chappelle's trans friend put it, was like, I'm just asking you to understand that I'm having a human experience here, and that is an incredibly sympathetic place to be. And that it's very hard to think of any of the people that I know who have come to be critical of gender ideology who do not sympathize with a person who feels that way. So there has been an incredible amount of common ground, maybe not middle ground, but common ground and goodwill that has been squandered by activism that has tried to deny reality, has tried to enforce dogmas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that doesn't, I just don't see that, to me, what that does is it just creates resistance.
Yes. Of course it does.
The people who are going to resist you already are just now going to do it that much more, you know, and you can't just make them go away. I feel like the only solution is to try to find a middle ground, to find consensus, or at least find some sort of general place of peace where everybody can be like, live and let live, do your thing, and that's fine. But this is kind of what's become the issue, is that you have, you know, MAGA QAnon nuts who are just screaming their heads off at anything that smells like a liberal. You get classified in a certain place. And I just see that the same thing happens with the extremes on the left as well. And I think if there's anything that I find heartening, is that the pendulum does have a tendency to constantly come back to the middle. But at each, you know, point of extreme, there's this concern of there being some sort of a fallout, some sort of a consequence to what happens. And that's kind of how I feel right now with the whole the Roe v. Wade thing, because the party that should be the ones to champion female rights has given up its ability to do that. And you know, it's a sad thing. Like, it's not to, you know, to talk about this is not to like try to be indulging in the drama. It's to point out like, hey, this is not good, and hopefully we correct. I feel as though there are some positives. Everything that's happening right now with Bette Midler and Macy Gray, I think, is kind of somewhat of an indication. Also, Maya Forstater, you know, winning in court. There's a variety of things that that to me are an indication of balance trying to be achieved. But I think that for many people, the question is how much damage will be done in the meantime. And when you are looking at young people who are of their own volition, even though they don't have fully developed brains, are undergoing elective castrations and mastectomies and pumping themselves with hormones, and this is all being propped up by the medical community, right? In many regards, not entirely, but this to me
it wouldn't be possible for young people to do this to themselves. That requires capture of the medical profession.
This is kind of, to me, leads into a larger discussion about what the future holds for humanity as this debate evolves. What do you think?
When it comes to moving forward, I do not think that there is a middle ground between, does the law recognize the reality of sex, or does the law enforce a fiction of gender identity? I do think, let me cut that. I do think, I would say, whenever I talk to trans activists, when I have talked to friends, including friends that I have subsequently lost to this issue, one of the questions that I've had for them is, what is the future that you see here? Is it a future where everybody who feels uncomfortable with sex role expectations, do they all get mastectomies and hysterectomies and
Right.
vaginectomies and like go on to live in this other role? Because that doesn't seem like a future that anybody should want.
No, and that is for me is kind of like what I feel like is, in some ways, there's a branch happening here between human beings who decide to use technology to enhance themselves and human beings who don't do that at all, or are very minimalist. And I feel as though there are inevitably going to be individuals who are going to try to push the boundaries. And the laws are going to be forced in many ways to kind of form themselves around those kinds of people. So this is one of the reasons why I do feel like this is an important question to talk about, important thing to talk about, because I do feel as though the people who are most affected by this are young people, are children, because this is the world that they're growing up in. It's right now, we're at this point where everybody has a phone, everybody has computers. It wasn't too long ago that Google Glass was about to come out on the scene, and everybody was going to be like suddenly living in this kind of virtual world and stuff. And that got shelved for a variety of reasons. I think I think there was maybe some sort of a realization or consensus that this was going to cause a lot of accidents, and people were going to be Pokemoning their way off of cliffs and stuff, not paying attention, watching Netflix while they got their glasses on, kind of thing. But to me, this is kind of like a like holding back this kind of maybe event horizon where humanity starts to adopt technology, and technology gets closer to it, to the point where it's like, at what point does man and machine start to merge and become in a symbiosis, right? And how far do we as humans go in that direction? I think there are some people who have very progressive mindsets in this regard, and they're kind of eager to embrace any progress that comes down the line. And I kind of feel as though, being that I was born in the 80s, I kind of exist just on the cusp of this change. And so for me, it's like, I'm not that inclined in that direction, maybe to some degree, but the idea of putting something in my body to me is like, no, thank you. But I could totally see how a young kid growing up is going to be all about that, especially when you consider gaming culture and everything, and just how common it is to.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of incentives pushing toward wearable tech, toward, I think a lot of what I would say is something that I've often wondered about with the trans debate is like, why is there so much power here?
Right.
And I do think that the transhuman stuff, in which I'm not remotely an expert, but I really like what Mary Harrington has written about it, like, that's where a lot of the juice is coming from. And transgenderism is a very sympathetic front for difficult questions that we will have to confront as a society, as this push to integrate, to what is it, to optimize human beings.
Yeah, sure. Right.
Like, I think that will come up in a bunch of settings, and that those issues are coming up first under the guise of trans rights.
This is kind of where I feel like the word trans has it is attractive in all the right ways. just that word right there, trans, not transgender, not this, that, but just trans. I feel like there's something attractive about that, that is attracting a certain type of person in a similar way to a religion.
Okay.
Because it's this idea of transcendence. I feel like it's this idea of transcending our limitations. And if you're trans, then you feel like you have done that.
Yeah.
And there's that sense of superiority, I think. And I think it bleeds through very obviously. Learn to code, you know. that to me is very emblematic of this mentality. Is this idea of superiority, and the people the friends that I have lost because of this, I feel, this is just my personal feeling, I feel a certain amount of discrimination in my direction just because of the fact that it's somewhat known that I grew up in a conservative background. So it's kind of like, well, we know that I know what your background is, and you still haven't disconnected yourself from your evangelical bigotry. And I'm like, really? Like, how far do I have to go? Like, that's kind of been my question, is like, how far do I have to go to, you know, I've already done the hardest part. I left my family, I left my religion, I left I left everything because I was convinced that there were issues in that. I convinced that there were distortions and delusions. So being that being the case, I feel like I do have a perspective on this, and I do kind of feel when I feel it when the strands of indoctrination are trying to wrap themselves around me, and I'm like, oh, I remember this. This feels very, very familiar. And I spent, 23 years trying to get out of this last time. So I'm not going to make the same mistake this time. But it's like that, this is kind of where we're kind of pointing in this direction earlier. And it kind of makes me wonder whether or not the laws are going to have to morph. And I almost feel like maybe the Maya Forstater thing, court case is sort of pointing in this direction, is that it's almost like becoming laws around religious beliefs. Like, okay, if you want to believe that gender ideology is a thing, then that's your belief. But we also need to protect the beliefs of people who don't believe that. And it kind of seems to me that that's where the law is being forced to go, is to treat this almost like religious denominations. And, it's like a form of tolerance that we all need to have. But in the meantime, kind of seems like there's a little bit of maybe way to go before people can just try to relax a little bit on this and find a middle ground. In the meantime, it very much to me seems like theologians screaming at each other doctrinal points. You know what I mean? It's like, well, I think the Bible says that God made man and a woman. It's like, no, I think the Bible, it means that there is no gender and whatever, right? Is it possible that it really is on some level just a subjective thing, that there is no immutable truth in this regard, and that we all are just these strange male female hybrids, and just never realized it until very recently. I think that myself, I tend to feel that no, there are immutable truths. There are things that we cannot deny. And I like the perspective has been stated before. I think it was Billboard Chris who said, two genders, infinite personalities, or two sexes, infinite personalities. And that's where I kind of put myself. And I'm like, why is that a problem?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say about, I think that if you carry the trans activist vision of the future all the way forward, we have the endless creation of distress and medicalized responses to that distress, and then the government pays for it and everybody else celebrates it. And the more gender critical vision of the future is that we say, as long as we're human, we're stuck with sex. And the law needs to be able to see that, but you can be any way that you want to be. You're just male or female. but that is not a prescription on your behavior, on your interests, on the way that you express and present yourself. It's very hard for me to see that as, it's very hard for me to imagine what people are hearing when they hear that as this regressive and essentialist future. Does that, maybe delete that line. I would say, like, okay, what I mean is, I have said this to friends who are diehard trans activists, and they have never responded to either side of this, to the vision that I lay forward of if we carry gender identity the way that we conceive it right now forward into the future, and the vision that I lay out where it's like, okay, what if we have sex? Okay, sorry, let's start that over again. I don't know.
You're okay. You're okay. Just you know, take your time.
Yeah.
Sometimes these, you know, they're big thoughts to deal with and trying to.
Well, I feel like this isn't even a big one, and it's just tripping me up. I see that as being a very progressive and free future. That's all that I really want to say.
Progressive and free in terms of what exactly? Like finding a balance in this regard?
I think if we say people are male and female, and you can be male or female any way that you want to be.
Yeah. I think, yeah. I think that is where I see is more of a balance. And I might have assumed prior to maybe 5-10 years ago that that's the direction we were going.
Me too.
And then all of a sudden this showed up.
Yeah.
So I feel as though it's kind of like, I would say almost like a cry for help. I feel like it's well, there's other ways of looking at it too, but it's kind of like, you cannot ignore this. Okay, well, what is this? What's going on? What are you asking us to not ignore? And I have some thoughts on this, and it's kind of it kind of digs into some difficult territory where it kind of becomes a conversation about men and women, and just the rise of feminism, the just kind of where we are right now in the past like 10 years. This is just my sense, and I'd like to hear what you think about this. Is I feel as though this is kind of a reaction to the rise of feminism over the past 50 years, and especially over the past like 10-20 years, to where the misogynistic undertones that are kind of coming through all of this with the whole trans women are women, and just the way that that's really taken the forefront of this discussion. It's like trans men are men. Nobody ever says that. But the trans women are women thing, to me, it's kind of like, okay, what's going on here? Why is it that there's so many men who are demanding this? They're demanding to be considered as a class of women. And what I would speculate is that this is a unfortunate reaction to the feminine empowerment movement, where you have certain men who they are feeling disenfranchised and left out, and also maybe disempowered themselves. I think that because of the prevalence of, you know, it's become very common to talk about toxic masculinity. And I think that just as a class, the male class is probably rightfully so. You know, there's a lot of mistrust surrounding males. And I feel that psychologically, there are certain males who their way of trying to get out of that is to then identify as female. It's their way of trying to get away from this perception of them as being bad or whatever because they're male. And as a male, I do feel as though there are certain um, there's certain discussions that aren't being had on a larger level, because a lot of times it's difficult to talk about things without certain accusations flying. And I think that men have a tendency to retreat
Okay.
and not talk about things if they feel like um, I don't know, just it's kind of like, to me, is somewhat of a general thing with men. Men don't necessarily like to talk about things. You know what I mean? It's kind of a cliche, but I think it's like um, I think it's relevant in this regard. But I feel as though that is the big mix in all of this, is that we're looking at this kind of dynamic between men and women, the male and the female, the idea of balance, the idea of gender, gender nonconformity and toxic masculinity and all this kind of stuff, and trying to find this balance. And I think I think that this is somewhat of an indication of the imbalance that exists in the world. And it's like, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with the incel community? How do we deal with trans women, men identifying as women, and demanding that they be included in women's spaces? There, to me, is an obvious reaction from the male community to some of the things that have happened over the past like 20 years. Like, just looking at for example, just the backlash against the recent Star Wars movies, and how many male fans just picked that apart because of it having a main female character.
Okay. I have to admit, I have never seen a Star Wars movie, so this controversy really.
Well, it's very important to a lot of people. I'm just going to finish this thought because we got about a couple minutes here. But that, I think, is kind of like just where we are right now, is just that we're in this place of like, where do we find this balance? Can we find this balance between the masculine and the feminine, and as it's expressed in these myriad different ways? And I feel as though to some degree gender nonconformity is the answer there, but we've kind of overcorrected, and the overcorrection is, I think, related to unresolved trauma that exists as well within men, and the solutions to that have not been properly disseminated. When it comes to a lot of the same things that men have been dealing with for a long time in regards to toxic masculinity, a lot of that stuff is still buried, it's still not being dealt with, and men are still kind of being herded in a certain direction that kind of contributes to addiction to pornography and just mistreatment towards women and all that kind of stuff. So in regards to trying to find this balance, in regards to trying to get to a place to where there is more harmony between the sexes, this is kind of where I feel like is at the center of this, is there's this unresolved psychology, mass psychology, that just still is trying to work itself out. And right now we're just very much in the eye of the storm, I think, in that regard. So with all of that in mind, and just kind of winding down, it's something that, I think in this regard, all I have is just kind of ramblings and speculation. And I know that because I still lack a certain amount of coherence on the subject, it's very easy to probably take anything I say and dismantle it and kind of, point out holes in it and things of that sort. I think that at the end of the day, my stance to some degree just kind of comes from a, like I said, sort of a health and wellness perspective, and a feeling that they're, like we were talking about, just medicalizing every problem and every solution to those problems have to do with taking a pill or having to do with undergoing a certain surgery or like whatever. To me, I feel as though in many cases that is it's a band-aid for a bullet wound, and it's ignoring underlying issues in people's lives that a lot of times we don't have any control over or have little control over, because of the families that we're a part of, because of where we live, because of our income, because of, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's just so many things that contribute to who we are as people. And I think we're just dropping the ball in general when it comes to how we deal with these problems. And I think part of it is because there's a lack of coherence across the board. Because you have on one end of the spectrum, you have, religious extremists who have their solutions for life's problems. And then you have trans activists who are suggesting surgery as a path to self-realization. It's like, where is the middle ground here? And I the conversation presented here is hopefully to provide the audience with just that thought of what solutions am I applying to my problems? And am I really getting to where the source of the problem is, or am I ignoring all of the real problems because I don't want to really face them for what they are?
Yeah.
So yeah, with that in mind, and as we kind of wrap up, like just give me some of your thoughts about this conversation, about where you think this is going.
Sure. I think, sorry, some really loud noise outside.
It's okay. Actually, what I'll do is I'll ask you this question. If there is a middle ground to be found, and we kind of dug at this before, but we'll just kind of use this as our conclusion here. If there's a middle ground to be found, what does that look like? Sure.
I don't know why they're starting a construction project at 9:38 at night, but it's really loud. Okay, so we did talk about middle ground or common ground a little. It was in the context of, I think the common ground that we have is that our ideas of what it is to be a man or a woman can be too restrictive, and that there are people who feel excluded from that. Trans activists would say that the answer is to radically redefine men and women to be detached from being male and female. And I think what someone like me would say is to have, there are a lot of ways to be a man, and there are a lot of ways to be a woman. And all it takes to be a man is to be male, an adult and human and male at the same time. And all it takes to be a woman is to be adult and human and female at the same time. But it has been hard to see friends, and it's been hard to see young people in particular struggle with these ideas of not living up and being told by a movement and being told by society as a whole that, when they feel like there's something wrong with them because they don't live up to these ideals, to have society agree with that is something that's really painful to see. To have society say, you're right, you're not being a girl the right way, so maybe you're really a boy.
Right.
That's something that I hope that we can leave in the past.
Sure.
I hope that in a couple of years we look back and we say, wow, that was a crazy time.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I get somewhat saddened to think about the people who who might be the collateral damage in this, 10 years down the line, they're the ones who are the detransitioners who say like, wow, what a mistake I made. And I can't
Yeah.
believe that society was complicit in this deception to allow me to do this. That to me it just makes me sad, is really what it comes down to. It makes me sad to think that somebody is going to have to wake up to that realization that your problems don't go away when you transition. You still have to deal with life. You still have to deal with reality. And the world doesn't just automatically open up and make way for you just because you've decided to make this change that makes sense to you for whatever reason, but it doesn't necessarily make sense to other people. And if you are enforcing your worldview on other people, and specific to, determining that a woman is just a superficial construct, it's not something that's real, it's just something made up, and anybody who identifies it can do so. It's like, I think for me as a man, it also, I find I'm just, there's a part of me that just goes, what are you asking me to do? You know what I mean? Because it sounds to me as though you're asking me to deny my senses in regards to an individual who says that they're a woman, that my natural feelings that I know, if I am in the presence of a woman, it's like, I know what a woman is. You're telling me that when somebody, a male, identifies as a woman, presents themselves to me, that something is wrong with me for not drawing that same parallel, for not looking at a man who's presenting himself as a woman. And this is just kind of where I'm like, what are you asking me to do? And we won't go any further deep into it, but I'll just leave it sort of at that sort of place. It's just, this is where it comes down to the religious indoctrination. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I think this is something that it isn't good for someone who's asked to play along. It's also not good for the person who is asking society to play along. You're creating an identity out of something that you can only be to the extent that other people see you the way that you want to be seen. And the world just doesn't work like that.
It just doesn't work.
It is not a basis for a secure sense of self and a resilient sense of self. It's just a recipe for a lot of hurt.
And that's my concern. My concern is like, this is what the trans lobby is doing, is it's creating these expectations in people's minds. And what they end up finding out is that they get this backlash, and they're creating this messaging of, if you don't, trying to think of the word here, but if you don't confirm everyone who says that they're trans, well, then if they commit suicide, then it's your fault. You're indirectly responsible. What I see is that contributes, I feel like, if anything, that sort of plants the idea in someone's mind. Okay, if I don't get what I want, this is the thing I want to transition. If I don't get what I want, I'm going to kill myself. This is kind of where it reminds me of the phrase luxury cult.
Mm-hmm.
And that concern that I have is that this is on some level is sort of attractive, as like, this is this thing that I want to spend my money on. And that kind of desperation that sort of builds in people when they want to buy something, when they want to spend money to get something, and it's just sort of like a compulsion. And I think we've all had the experience of buying something and then afterwards having buyer's remorse, right? So sometimes, in life, like, that's what happens. We want something. I've bought plenty of things that I bought them, I used them twice, and I never looked at them ever again. And so I feel that kind of does a good job of sort of expressing to some degree where this comes from, and it's somewhat concerning when you look at it from that perspective. A luxury cult, this kind of this push to go buy something that you feel like you need, and until you get it, you won't be satisfied. And if you don't get it, you might commit suicide. Whoa, man, really? Really? Okay. You don't think that there might be something else going on?
Yeah, it's obvious that you're trying to buy something that can't be bought.
Yeah.
And in the case of transition, you're paying an extremely high price for something that can't be bought.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like that's a good place to kind of wrap this up.
Okay.
It's a good thought to kind of leave things on. And just I'll just say, you know, for anybody who's listening, this is not an attack on anybody who would be gender non-conforming. In fact, if anything, I'd like to think that that's kind of what we're saying here, is that you could be gender non-conforming, express yourself however you like. When you get to the point to where you start demanding that other people talk the way that you do and that they can affirm all of your decisions, I think at that point you've kind of divorced yourself of reality, because life just doesn't work that way. And going in that direction, I think the inevitable result is conflict. On that note, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. You know, we kind of rolled a few things around. There's a lot of different rabbit holes that I'm sure we could go down if we wanted to. I like to think that we just kind of left things as positive as possible. For anybody listening, you know, it's not about attacking anyone, you know, it's not about hating on anyone. It's just, it comes down to just basic disagreements about things sometimes, and kind of got to be okay with that. If you can't be okay with that, then all it does is it contributes to more chaos and conflict in the world. And right now we need the opposite of that. Eliza, thank you so much. We'll have this up soon. If anybody wants to find you, they can find you at elizamondegreen.substack.com. They can find you at Eliza Mondegreen on Twitter as well. Anything else that people should know?
No, thank you so much, Adam. And I do apologize for, I don't know what's going on my street, but.
Well, I can't actually hear anything, so it's okay.
Okay, it's like almost deafening for me.
That's so strange. Yeah, because I cannot hear. You must have maybe something on your computer that that blocks out, or maybe it's Zoom. Maybe Zoom is using its magic.
Yeah, that Zoom filter that like makes your skin look really smooth, but it also like takes out the construction noise.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Eliza,
All
thank
right.
you so much.
Thank
I'm
you
gonna
so
go
much,
ahead.
Adam.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and